Hi, my name is Master Craig Stanley. I'm an 8th degree black belt, and I want to talk to you about Sinewave. Sinewave in Taekwondo is a very misunderstood concept. I think part of it comes from the name, Sinewave. It may or may not be the proper way to explain it or to define it. When people understand what a sine wave is, it can make them start thinking about up and down movement, and that's it. But sine wave is much more than that. I think the most basic sine wave action comes from a walking stance where you drop down, come back up again, and then drop down to your normal position and finish your technique. That is one type of sine wave, but I think a lot of people are still not understanding what the purpose is. And that's what I want to explain in this segment. First of all, let's just take the most common one, because there are many types of sine waves, or many forms of sine wave. For this one, the walking stance, when you drop down, when you bend your knee and lift the heel slightly off the floor, you're relaxing and releasing your muscles. The second portion of this is an upwards movement. Accompanied with this upwards movement, there should also be some hip pull. The reason we're releasing our foot off the ground and relaxing our leg is to allow us to get our entire body into the technique, thus adding more power. We're adding power from driving the leg and from driving the hip. A lot of people stay on a full face position, drop, lift, and drop, only using their hands. So the drop, lift, and drop add absolutely nothing to the technique other than some movement. Drop, lift, pull, and drive. That is going to increase the power of the technique in this particular sine wave. But there are other kinds of sine waves. The next one I'd like to talk about is shifting from one stance to another. The two terms that General Choi used are pulling or slipping. Slipping is the one that is going to create more power. It is the technique, I think, that pretty much every martial artist out there uses when they go to break something. One board or two boards could probably force your way through it. But when you get up into 5 and 6 boards, you do need to create a sine wave motion. And again, now in this case, yes, there is up and down motion. But more importantly, there is forward motion and there is hip torque motion. If I'm in an L stance and I'm going to shift to a walking stance doing a technique, for instance in the pattern Chungun, we go from a knife hand guard to an upward elbow strike, I'm going to create a sine wave motion. I'm going to pull my lead foot back, which yes, does bring me up. And then I'm going to go into my walking stance, which brings me down. That is the general definition of sine wave, the up and down motions. But what's really happening here, from my L stance, I pull back. I am loading up with technique, with power for my technique. And then I drive forward. So I have mass in the equation, and then I have torque, hip torque, body torque, shoulder torque to do the technique. There's a rule in Taekwondo. Every action must start with movement in the opposite direction, with a few exceptions. For instance, if I'm in a walking stance and I want to do a front snap kick with my back leg, I don't move it backwards and then do my front snap kick, so that is an exception to the rule. But even learning Chunji, the first pattern, if we look at the feet, creating a sine wave motion, following the rule that General Choi said about every action starts with movement in the opposite direction, we look at the foot, it starts to draw in slightly and then go out to the technique. That action of drawing in and bending this leg and putting weight on this leg creates the sine wave action, the sine wave motion. Without it, the practitioner becomes very stiff, and when you're very stiff on a technique, the technique is going to lose efficiency, thus losing power. So we could stiffly move out to our technique, or we could relax, foot comes in, and we go out. And that is sine wave motion. That allows us to drive our hip into the technique, increasing the power. One thing you have to watch out for is the distance these feet move when you're creating the sine wave. And in many different techniques, many different stances, you're going to have to watch because there are going to be some subtle differences. The general rule is, though, the foot that's moving comes to within half a shoulder width of the stationary foot before moving out to its new position or new stance. So if I'm in a parallel ready stance, getting ready to do the pattern Chun-Ji, my left foot will draw in to the center line, which is half a shoulder width. It comes in. I can then put my weight on my right leg. And then I go out to my new stance, the walking stance. Sine wave up and down motion really doesn't add a whole lot. Think of this. If I had my foot and I put a brick 2 inches above my foot, maybe 3 inches above my foot, and I dropped it, I would certainly feel it. It probably wouldn't break my toe or anything like that, but it would likely hurt. Take that same brick and hold it up to shoulder height and drop it. It lands on my foot. Very good chance it's going to break some bones in my foot. It will certainly hurt a lot more. And that's the difference between our sine wave motion and a huge sine wave motion. In order to add power from up and down action, we're going to have to do a huge up and down action. The little up and down action that we have in sine wave, in particular in the walking stance, down, up, down, is only a few inches. So really the up-down action is not going to add anything to our technique. What it does is it allows us to release the muscles from our lower body instead of locking them in place. And it allows us to now drive with the leg. It allows us to torque the hip into the technique. And that is where the extra power comes from when executing sine wave properly. A straight up and down motion with no hip and no leg drive is simply arm motion. So literally you wouldn't need to do this. There are a lot of naysayers out there, senior belts, that don't understand sine wave completely. So they freeze the bottom legs and they just use their arms because they say sine wave adds nothing. That is only because they don't really understand what sine wave does add or how it does add power. In a nutshell, and to summarize, sine wave allows you to mobilize your mass into your technique. It allows you to drive with your base leg, and it allows you to torque or drive in with your hip. Adding those three things, the mass, the drive with the leg, and the drive with the hip, nobody can argue that there's not more power there. So sine wave definitely has its place in the martial art of Taekwondo. And if you look at any other martial artist, any other style, and even the old style Taekwondo people, when they go to break boards, they use sine wave. They may not call it sine wave, but that is what General Choi was putting into his martial art to create more power. Thank you.